Okay, good morning, everyone. Looks like we only got a few people here live today, but this is Peyton. It's April 22nd. This is GEO 319 Surface Processes lecture, and I'm recording it, and we'll post this on Moodle as we go. So, I'm back for a couple more lectures here. I talked a bit with Andrew about what you guys have covered since I've been gone, and I'll hope to not duplicate too much. And as we move forward here, so we're going to start a new topic, and that is thinking about what the influence of humans is on these natural systems that we've been learning about for the majority of the class. And the main objective that I'd like to accomplish is to think about is to make you guys aware that in the Earth system now, humans are a major player in controlling these major Earth systems that we've discussed so far. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we will start with some lecture and I've got a few PowerPoint slides, and then we'll transfer to probably taking some notes in a little bit. So let me share my screen. Let's maximize PowerPoint. Oh, got a few more people joining. Okay, so today we're gonna start wrapping our minds around human influence, and I talked a little bit with Andrew, and he said he had introduced this idea of the concept of the Anthropocene. And this is an idea that that we would look in the geologic record and see evidence of humans. And what I would like to do is talk about really how are we influencing these major Earth systems, and really like what is the way that we are influencing these systems. So the first thing I wanted to do is talk about what are the sort of major systems that we've considered so far. So this class is about surface processes, and so far we've talked about things like the energy cycle, the water cycle, the sediment cycle, and geomorphic shape and control, and biogeochemical cycles. So these are the major processes or the major cycles at work in the critical zone. And we are now, entering this phase of human existence where I would argue that humans are now the principal controlling factor in all of these major cycles at the Earth's surface. And I'm going to go about talking about some of those ways in which we control these cycles. But I think it's a really sobering thought, and and the thought that all of us need to carry forward as we tackle problems in earth science. And that is that, you know, we are exerting, if not the strongest control, one of the stronger controls on any one of these major cycles. And our influence and our action is huge. That has both consequences for bad behavior, but also a lot of really strong potential. If we understand our influence, we can control it and engineer and design better systems. So let's think about some of these cycles. So the first one, the first cycle I want to talk about is water and the hydrologic cycle. And the ways in which we are affecting the hydrologic cycle are large and very complex and varied. And I'm just going to give a few examples here, and then perhaps we could discuss some other ideas of ways that humans are affecting the water cycle. So one of our principal ways that we exert control on hydrology is to change the way that water runs off the land surface, and the timing of runoff and the volume of runoff. And the principal way that we do this is through dams. And really starting in about the 1930s with the New Deal and trying to think about how we break out of the Great Depression, a lot of federal spending. Well, the Department of, or the Army Corps of Engineers gets on this bandwagon of building dams and creating water projects that distribute water for agriculture. All right, so on the map here is, you know, the north. We're focused in on the northwest of the U.S. and I've mapped the coloring here is the sort of mean annual precipitation. All right, and then I have the major U.S. waterways. All right, are these blue lines, and each green dot is a registered dam with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And these dams vary in sizes. And I can tell you already that I know of many more, like in the Bitterroots up high in the mountains, that aren't even plotted here. But some of them are very small, just earthen dams. Some of them are very large, you know, creating things like Fort Peck Reservoir. So they're not, you know, they're not all equal in volume or in effect, but I think you can just gain from this map an appreciation for how many dams we have, and how many diversions and mechanisms of storing surface runoff are. So if I scale out to the country, now here's a plot of all the registered dams with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And it's getting really hard to find very many sections of stream that don't have a dam on them for very long. All right, and there's no free-flowing large streams anywhere in the nation. All right, so we are very much in control of stream flow and determining how much and when this water runs off. So in principle here, we cannot control at the moment where and when and how much precipitation we get. That's limited by atmospheric processes. But in terms of controlling the water once it's in the stream network, we are very much in control of that, and we decide when and where and how much water moves through these stream networks via these dams. The level of coordination and actual planning of this control is pretty variable. Some basins have, you know, at least plans where water movement is coordinated throughout the basin, but many of them are very ad hoc and just dependent upon sort of water rights. So humans are really in control of stream flow, and dams are this really physical, easy to recognize way that we are controlling the movement of water. But there's a lot of other ways, more subtle ways, and ways we have, many ways we haven't even thought about completely, that we are controlling the flow of water. So here's an example of the effects of irrigation. So one of the first things here is that many of these dams were put in here. There's basically two reasons you put a dam in. One is just to control flooding and keep main stems from flooding. But the second is for agriculture. And so many of these dams are for agriculture. And in the Western US, most of them are for irrigation and irrigation projects. And one of the ways that irrigation has many, many effects on the hydrologic cycle. So I wanted to take a look at a fairly recent study on sort of large scale, almost continental scale effects of irrigation on the hydrologic cycle. So this is, I'm going to show a couple figures out of a paper from the Journal of Hydrology. And this first one starts off with a systems diagram, all right, of the continental water cycle, all right? So one of the things that, I've been trying to get us to think a lot about as we go on in class is these systems diagrams, is thinking about systems work. And sort of as an aside, as we look at this systems diagram, there's been a couple labs where I've asked you guys to draw a systems diagram, and I'm getting a lot of different interpretations of what a systems diagram is. All right. This is a systems diagram. It has boxes that are reservoirs. So one reservoir is atmospheric water vapor. All right. It is diagrammed as a box. All right. Now, I have another reservoir, the coastal ocean. All right. It's a box. The communication or the connection between those two boxes are these arrows, right? And these are the processes by which we might transfer, say, here, this is a water systems diagram. So how we would transfer water from the coastal ocean, say, to the atmosphere. So by what process, here's an arrow right here. What process does this arrow represent? What process does this arrow from the coastal ocean to the atmosphere represent? What is the main way I get water vapor from the ocean to the atmosphere?
Evaporation.
All right, evaporation. So here's a great example of two reservoirs. I have thought about a process. So I have a flux between those two reservoirs, and I could even write the process. It's evaporation. All right, so similarly, we can think about all these other things. If I'm transferring atmospheric water vapor to the soil and plants, all right, I've got this red arrow here. What process is that?
Condensation.
Precip.
Condensation is potentially one, but that's a very, I'll say, very small one. What is the major way we get water to soil out of the atmosphere?
Precipitation.
Ah, precipitation. Okay. So precipitation and condensation, we could say here for arrow 4. All right. Okay, so systems diagram, it's a way of breaking up this really complicated thing into a series of reservoirs and fluxes between them. This is what I'm talking about. This is what I want to see when I say draw a systems diagram. All right. And the trick is figuring out what my major reservoirs are, what are the connections between them, and sort of what is the boundary of my system. All right, so this is our series of blocks, and some of the important things that this paper considers is this idea of taking water from aquifers through irrigation, all right, putting them back onto the soil and plants, and the effect of this now enhanced water flux out of aquifers and into soil and plants. All right, so the first thing I wanted to do here is talk about this systems diagram and the basic idea, and that is that we're pumping out of aquifers, we're irrigating these crops, all right? When we do that, we have downstream effects in our system. So as I add water to the soil and plants, what is this process, this arrow right here, moving from soil and plants back up to the atmosphere? What process is that?
Evapotranspiration, sir.
Yeah, ET. Okay. So if I am taking water out of aquifers, enhancing the amount of water on the soil, what do you think I'm doing to the volume of evapotranspiration?
It's increasing.
It's increasing. All right. What potentially could be happening then to 4 here?
It could also increase.
Yeah, so I can have these effects, and the systems diagram allows me to trace these effects by looking at the arrows. So by taking water out, enhancing the evapotranspiration, I'm increasing the atmospheric water vapor, all right? And I could have things like increased precipitation. All right, so I could also, so one of the, another process we have is that aquifers are connected to rivers, all right? But via either discharge from the aquifer to the river or recharge from the river to the aquifer. By changing the amount of water in the aquifer, I will have effects on stream flow. All right. So we talked a lot about runoff processes and thinking about where our water in a stream comes from. When do you think that groundwater discharge makes up the majority of stream flow discharge. So when is this arrow, this red arrow here, most important? During precipitation events or during dry times?
Be during dry times.
So we would expect our low flows, all right, our times when we're at base flow, if we're taking water out of our aquifer, putting it up here on the soil to have increased evapotranspiration, we might expect that our streams, especially during times of base flow, would have decreased stream flow. All right. If we've got areas where this route into the increased water vapor, and then we precipitate in places where we're not irrigating, we could see increased stream flow. So this paper here, they start off with this systems diagram, and then they hypothesize some of these changes that we might see. They use the systems diagram to think about types of changes within the continental scale hydrologic system that we might expect to see. And one is that in the areas where there's a lot of irrigation, we might expect to see decreased stream flow, all right? As we pull water out of our aquifers, put them on soil and plants, and get enhanced evapotranspiration. In areas where we've been augmenting the atmospheric water vapor, we have increased precipitation, but we're not pulling out of our local aquifers, all right? We might expect increased precipitation, but we don't have increased evapotranspiration. In those areas, we might see increased stream flow. All right, so these are the kinds of things, while this system of blocks and arrows may seem very simple, it allows us to think about the potential interactions and cascades of interactions that we might see in a complicated system. All right, so before we go too much farther, I did want to take a little bit of time and just talk a bit about this particular example of the Great Plains Aquifer and what's going on here. So I'm gonna pull up a note here. Just talk a bit about the Great Plains Aquifer. So who here knows what has anybody here heard of the Ogallala Aquifer or the Great Plains Aquifer system?
Yeah.
So what do you know? What do you know about it?
Sir, it's a regional flow aquifer, so it doesn't have a modern recharge like the aquifers around us in Missoula.
Okay, what else does someone Mark?
I heard
pretty active.
Most of the water, yeah, most of the water came from the last melting of the glaciers, and so it's not getting recharged to the extent that the intermontane aquifers do around here. So you keep pulling
I've heard
water
that
out, and it's not getting put back in.
Okay, Mark, why don't you let someone else have some turns here?
Yes, sir.
All right, Wendell, what else have you heard?
that it's a major source of like irrigation water for like the breadbasket.
Yeah, so both Mark and Wendell are right. So let me draw a conceptual cross section here. Here is the Rocky Mountains. All right. And they come out onto the high plains. All right. Out and In the at the far end of the high plains, we'll put the Mississippi River. All right. Okay, so there's this series of sedimentary rocks in these big, deep basins. Here's the fault. So here's our Rocky Mountains. And these are sedimentary units. So we got a bunch of shales. We've got limestones. We've got sandstones. And this sequence of aquifers is really long. It takes up basically a good portion of the US from the Rocky Mountain front all the way out to the Mississippi River. All right. And there's all these large flow paths of groundwater. And the basic idea is that they are recharged either in the mountain front or right along the mountain front. And you've got these really long flow paths that eventually may discharge to the Mississippi. We actually don't know a lot about where and when and if they actually naturally discharge, but they must. All right. Now, the other thing that Mark said that's accurate is that they are receiving their recharge way up here at the Rocky Mountains. All right. And many people are extracting water down here, as Wendell said, in the breadbasket out in the plains. All right. So here they're pumping water for irrigation. All right. This water is being recharged right now, but it was recharged. There was more recharge occurring during ice ages. So much of the water in these aquifers is from the last ice age, at least. So we're talking about, waters. A lot of these waters are 30,000 years old or more. All right, so this is really old water. We call it fossil water. It was recharged in a different climate, much of it. One thing that is not probably, there is recharge occurring in these aquifer systems now. It's just not to the extent that it was during the Ice Age. All right. And as Wendell correctly said, it's a major source of irrigation to the breadbasket of the U.S. So here on this map, over here that we're looking at of the system diagram, they have outlined the major high plains aquifer system. All right, and sort of originating from the Rocky Mountain front and heading out towards the Mississippi. And this is the major area of irrigation. Turns out once you get much past this, you don't have to irrigate too much. There's enough precipitation. But out here, we have a lot of irrigation, and most of that irrigation is from groundwater. All right, they are certainly, without a doubt, pulling out water faster than it's being recharged right now. So at the moment, there's a net, loss of water to these aquifer systems for sure. And so as a result, we're seeing really large depletions in the volume of water in these aquifer systems. So so there's one of the things that gets lost in a systems diagram is thinking about this temporal aspect. So here in the Ogallala or in the Great Plains Aquifer, much of the volume of the storage in this aquifer system is old water. It came from a different time, all right? And so even though there is recharge to the aquifer system, we are right now pumping at a much higher rate than that recharge system. So we're drawing the storage down. So thinking about where and when the storage in these reservoirs came from can be important. Okay, so let's go back. Here's the Ogallala system. All right, this is a sort of the main figure from this paper. So here again is the map of the entire Great Plains aquifer system. And then shaded here is the amount of water table or water level decline or increase in the groundwater system. So anything that's sort of brown or red or yellow is a decrease in the water level. And then anything that is green and blue is an increase in the water level. So for vast majority of the Great Plains aquifer system, we're getting significant decreases in water level. We do have areas of increased water level. Why do you think I've got this linear stripe of increased water level up here that I'm circling sort of in the northern part of the Great Plains aquifer system?
Maybe there's a canal, like a ditch or something.
Yeah, there is a ditch. It's the Platte River. And we are irrigating out of the Platte. All right, we're taking water out of the Platte and we're spreading it across the irrigation, across the area around the Platte River. So this is a large irrigation system, and we're increasing recharge locally here. So we're seeing an increase in the water level in this particular area. So just a side note, but just to sort of show that, you know, you get different effects depending upon sort of the volume of irrigation and the connection between the reservoir and the irrigation source. All right, but bottom line, lots of water level decrease in the aquifers. All right, now here they've gone in and they've examined the changes in average stream flow, all right, for a bunch of different gauges. And if it's a decreasing stream flow, it's got this blue triangle. And if it's insignificant, it's got this green triangle. And the one I want to focus on here is B, because it's the late season flow. So this is the time of the year when groundwater should be most important in our stream flow system. And you can see here that we have decreasing flow in many of our stream gauges over the time record that they were analyzing, all right, which is sort of consistent with their hypothesis that by pulling out groundwater, we should be decreasing the base flow or the low flow. So it's these kinds of teleconnections between irrigation and stream flow that we may not think about too much. So there is also evidence of increased precipitation, summertime precipitation over the sort of Midwest of America due to this irrigation. So as we irrigate, we increase evapotranspiration, we increase the atmospheric water vapor. And during the summertime, over sort of the interior Midwest, we are seeing increased precipitation from convective storms due to this agricultural irrigation. All right, so lots of different ways that we are affecting the water cycle. And one way that that probably, you know, we're still figuring out, and we're just pulling out these trends of, say, increased precipitation, but we are affecting the precipitation cycle as well. Even though it's harder to detect, these kinds of effects of irrigation enhancing water vapor and causing increased precipitation are becoming more apparent, and we are starting to see that we're affecting all aspects of the water cycle. So stream flow, evapotranspiration, and precipitation.
So could that be why we see a lot more flooding in, say, the Tennessee Valley?
It could be. There's a lot of things going on there. There's certainly a lot of increased intensity of precipitation due to climate change. So it's pretty hard to say exactly how much is due to irrigation effects and how much would be due to the fact that we know that precipitation intensities are increasing. So it's one of the reasons why it's sort of hard for us to pull this signal out is because of the variability in precipitation and the many factors affecting it. It certainly wouldn't, it certainly probably contributes, let me put it that way, but how much it contributes, whether it's negligible or a lot, I don't know. Okay, so bottom line is that especially in the developed nations, but really all over now, humans are exerting strong control on the hydrologic cycle, and in all phases of the hydrologic cycle. Okay, so another place that humans are exerting strong control is in sedimentation and in the movement of sediments. So we started off our example with dams and dam building. And here's an example of those dams affect both the water cycle, but also the sediment that's transported with that water. So this is a graph here that shows the several things of the Yangtze River as it discharges into the Pearl River, the Pearl River as it discharges to the ocean in China. And the blue line here is the water discharge, right? So that's the volume of water coming out of the river. And the red is the total mass of sediment, and the green is the concentration of sediment in the water. All right. So if we follow this here, we're going along, and the discharge in the Pearl River is remaining roughly constant. All right. Out to the ocean. But we built as China industrializes, they've built several huge dams on the Yangtze, the largest dams in the world. And so downstream of those dams, all the sediment drops out behind the dams, and downstream of those dams, the sediment concentration has decreased and the sediment yield has decreased. So when we look at the discharge of sediment to the ocean, it's dropping dramatically as we go forward. All right, so this will have long-term consequences for things like building of deltas, the sediment supply for shore building. So, you know, as we stop sediment from moving out to the shores, we disrupt the balance between wave erosion and deposition, and we will see more and more coastal erosion and encroachment of seas inland. So these have huge consequences. So if we go back and we think about that distribution of all the dams in the United States, we can start to think about how strong an effect humans are having on the continental sediments balance, and in particular in places like the United States. And what we're seeing is, as a result, is a lot of coastal erosion, a lot of beach erosion, deltas. So the Mississippi Delta is now contracting at a really fast rate, and that's because of all our dams. We're drastically reducing the sediment supply out of the rivers. We also, as humans, do a lot of land use change. All right, so as an agricultural society, one of the big things we do is we take wildlands and we put them under agricultural production. And as we do that, we change the risk of various kinds of erosion. And so here's sort of a global map of the risk of induced wind erosion. And I don't think it's really far out for anybody to think that as you plow and you undergo land use change, you increase the chance for erosion. All right, and you can see these areas where humans are currently causing increased risk of wind erosion globally. And it's basically most of the arable land of the earth. We've increased the chance of wind erosion. All right. The main thing I want you guys to take away here is that this is another way in which we are controlling and exerting control on the movement of sediment and the shape of the earth. All right, so as we undergo landscape change and land use change, we are affecting the geomorphological properties and processes, and we should expect changes in the shape of the earth and distribution of coastlines, things like that. These are things that humans are definitely having a strong effect on. This is another map of sort of erosion risk, and basically the take-home message here is that the only places where soil health is stable are these sort of stippled patterns. All right, and it's just not much of North America. Most of it has some risk of increased erosion. So, bottom line, because of land use change, we are drastically changing the sedimentary cycle. And by some estimates, humans now, and at least their affected sediment changes, are now one of the principal we are one of the strongest forces at moving sediment globally. All right, so finally, we've already talked about this a lot, but we have huge influence on the biogeochemical cycles. And in particular, because of industrial fertilizer production, we are really controlling the distribution of nitrogen and phosphorus and the amount and the availability of nitrogen in ecosystems. We've talked about the consequences of that. We can cause eutrophication because we are adding nitrogen at higher rates. So we are now taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere via industrial processes, adding it to the soil. All right, so we can use our systems diagram here to think about that. But when we do that, when we add this nitrogen, we're essentially, humans are now one of the largest nitrogen fixers. All right, and we are putting in nitrogen. When we do that, we are really increasing the availability of reactive nitrogen. So all of these, so nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia, that's reactive nitrogen. Those are the, that's the nitrogen that is in forms that, you know, ecosystems can use. And this is a map of the exceedance of, so this is a map of reactive nitrogen exceedance. So we've added more nitrogen than the system can process. And so we should expect things like eutrophication and problems with nutrient nitrate contamination in waters. There's just more nitrogen than the ecosystems can process and use, and that can be re-released as nitrogen gas to the atmosphere. And so what I want you to see here is that, you know, good portion of the arable, you know, agricultural regions, we are now, we've added so much reactive nitrogen to the system that the critical zone can't control it all. All right, and so we should expect to see reactive nitrogen exceedances, and this is going to show up as things like eutrophication, nitrate contamination in groundwaters. These are going to be the norms over large portions of the world. All right, so in many respects, humans are now one of the strongest controlling factors for many of these global scale cycles. And we are really, really powerful as a species. And, you know, I just like to close that it's important to understand that we exert this influence. And the next phase, I think, of human coexistence on the earth is to think about how do we utilize our influence in a smart fashion. So right now, we're not thinking about it very long term. And so we know we need more crops and we add nitrogen. And now this has been a great thing. We produce more food and we're able to feed more people, but at the cost of nitrogen exceedances. Well, what if we start to think more clearly about the total nitrogen cycle, and how do we engineer our nutrient cycles globally to not have these massive exceedances of reactive nutrients? So what we'll do Thursday is start to talk about this concept of geoengineering. And this is the idea that we start to realize our global scale influence, and we start to engineer some solutions or some better systems to take advantage of our influence and manage the system in more sustainable or in fashions that change the entire globe to our liking. All right, so I've reached the end of lecture for right now. I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions if you have any.
Are you able to answer any questions about the lab?
Which lab? The GIS lab?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have. I mean, I know how to use GIS, but I
Yeah.
had no hand in creating the lab, or so I think I can help if you have general GIS questions, but probably you're better off talking to Luke or Andrew about specific questions.
Okay, I'll probably try to schedule something with Andrew. I tried to talk to Luke and didn't entirely get what I was looking for. I just had a weird thing where when I put the imagery on, it didn't line up with the map.
The
So like the question was to turn on the imagery for the
Yeah.
base map and then measure the length of the channel. And for some reason, it pulled up like a road and there was no stream on the stream channel that we had just built. So
Right.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think I can
it's
probably,
It's actually there. It's just very, very small.
okay.
Yeah,
the
it's like right next to the road.
It didn't line up with the things that we had been doing.
yeah, the problem is probably a projection problem. So you got to figure out who's projected and what. But I don't know what data sets you're working with or what projections they should be in. So
Yeah, that's okay. I just was
probably
wondering if you
an
knew anything.
Andrew question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.